Okay, gentlemen, welcome to a brief review for the new New York State, United States History and Government Regents. The Regents exam starting in 2022 is what is known as the new framework exam. It is very different from the exams that have been given previously in United States history. The material that's covered is very similar. Obviously, United States history still begins with the pre-colonial period, pre-contact, Columbus, and all of that, up through the colonies, the American Revolution, the early days of the American Republic, the Civil War, the later 1800s, the Progressive Era, populism, World War I, imperialism, the Great Depression, Second World War, Cold War. On the other hand, the way the material is tested is rather different from the way it was tested before. So if you look at exams, Regents exams, from before the year 2022, they're widely available online. You can find copies of them all over the place. It will test that material. There are some questions on there that may be helpful to you to review, but the questions you see on the Regents exam will not look the same. So we're going to do a review that hopefully will prepare you for the new exam. So there is material that may be helpful to you that we have generated. If you are watching this video, then you should have access through Schoology or your teacher somehow to two OneNote notebooks. One of them is labeled Outline of U.S. History Regents. The outline of U.S. History Regents is simply reproducing for you, with very few notes, the outline as given to us by the state of New York. In other words, this is the official outline of United States history as they offer it. It's very bare bones. It is not nearly enough to study from, but it does give you a general outline. And if you were to take this notebook and cut and paste from it, it would give you a kind of starting outline for your own study in your own notebook. The idea would be to cut and paste from it and then use that to expand on those notes as you study, as you look at material you don't recognize, things you don't remember, or things you have to reorganize in your head. Separately, you should have access to a notebook that says Review Notes in U.S. History Regents. This is that same notebook I mentioned before, but we have added some beef to that outline. We have gone through it and expanded it somewhat, again, to give you a little bit more of a running start as you do your own review. The first thing to talk about, though, and this is why you should be watching this video before the others, is an outline of the exam itself. What is it going to look like? So we begin the first section of this outline of the U.S. History Regents. We provide you with this test overview. As the state of New York explains it to us, the test will include 3 sections, and I'm going to pop this up just a little bit. The first section will be multiple choice, 28 questions. Each will be stimulus-based. We'll show you what that looks like and talk about it a bit in a moment. But the basic idea is that you will be given some kind of a document. It could be a quote from a historical piece. It could be a quote from a piece of what we call historiography. That is, a book by a historian about history, not a document, primary document from history. It could be a chart, a graph, a picture, a map, a propaganda poster, anything. That document will have 2 or 3, maybe even 4 multiple choice questions associated with it. So you'll be given that document, and then you'll be given several multiple choice questions after it. Each question will test your ability to recognize the historical event involved, or the period with which the document is associated, and to interpret the document and contextualize it, its meaning, its importance. This is important. The answers to the multiple choice questions will not be found in the document itself. In other words, you cannot look at the multiple choice question and find a sentence in the document that seems to match it to guess the answer. You will have to actually read the document, understand it, and place it into some kind of context in your mind. Only then will you be able to figure out most of those multiple choice questions. You can expect something like 9 sets of these. We don't know for sure, but mathematically that's going to how it's going to have to work out. 9, 10, something like that. For a total, we do know, of 28 questions. 28 questions is not a lot in part of the 3-hour time period you have to do the exam. But because it does require you to read and think about the documents, you are going to have to make sure that you keep an eye on your time. The second part of the exam are 2 short paragraphs, what are called, I'll put it in, CRQs, constructed response questions. What that means is you will have to write 2 short essays, a sort of large paragraph each. These are not particularly long essays. You'll be given a set of documents for each of these essays. In set 1, you will have 2 documents that are related to each other. You'll have to describe the historical context surrounding the documents, and then identify and explain the relationship between the events or ideas found in those documents. In other words, you're looking for cause and effect, similarity and difference, or turning point. You should be aware of those ideas from your class, but I will point out to you, you must be specific. So in order to get the full credit of points for set 1, if you're given 2 documents, one, let's say a poster for capturing escaped slaves, reward, post $100 for escaped slave, answers to the name of Joe, etc. And a second poster about a meeting of abolitionists. Well, first of all, you have to describe the fact that this is before the Civil War, in the lead up to the Civil War, as the 2 groups within the country began to come to more and more conflict. Slave owners and supporters of the slave trade, and abolitionists who were trying to abolish the slave trade. There's a little bit of historical context. And then you're going to describe that these 2 represent the difference between the 2 approaches to slavery. One group who wanted to hunt down slaves who had escaped and were willing to pay to get that back, and the other group that was working hard to make the slave trade illegal and even to help those escaped slaves so that they wouldn't have to be returned to their masters. And you would write a few sentences about that. That's identifying that similarity or difference, that is the relationship between the documents. If you don't mention something like that, you don't get full credit. The second set of documents, again, you'll be given 2, will require you again to describe the historical context surrounding them. So you'll have to identify what are these about, what time period are they happening in American history, and what's the issue that they're referring to. And then you're going to have to analyze and explain how the audience for the document, the purpose of writing the document, the bias behind the document, or the point of view of the writer or producer of the document, how one of those affects the document's use as a reliable source of evidence. In other words, you must tell me, or the grader, how reliable is this document as a source of historical information? And perhaps what historical information is it reliable for? And why you come to that conclusion. So if you have a letter home from a Civil War soldier describing a battle. Okay, well, first of all, we know that battle is a big event, and the point of view of the soldier is going to be different depending on whether they are a soldier of the line, regular infantryman, or a general who can sort of oversee the entire battle and knows what's going on. Also, there's going to be reliability issues based on whether they were on the winning or the losing side. What's the purpose of this document? Could be writing a letter home to mom to reassure her so that she doesn't worry. Could be writing a letter to a buddy who's also in the Army, trying to give him a kind of realistic view of what the battle was like. Could be a letter home to the folks to make them proud and maximizing your heroism. All of those are going to affect how reliable the document is. Remember, sophisticated thinking, good, solid, high school, Regents level thinking, not 6th grade, is not simple and yes and no, black and white, up and down. You cannot say the document is reliable or not reliable. It is more or less. Just because the fellow's writing home to mom and trying to reassure her that everything's okay doesn't mean it doesn't contain useful information. But you might have to be a little careful. Just because it's a general who's giving an official report on the battle, well, that would seem to be very reliable as an official document. Well, that doesn't mean he's not sort of minimizing his difficulties. So you think of it more on a spectrum, not yes or no, reliable, unreliable, but more or less reliable, and sometimes it could be very reliable for expressing, say, a soldier's own fears, but not so reliable in the details of the combat because he was looking at it from a very narrow perspective. So for these two short paragraphs, the constructed response questions, in both cases, you must use both documents to answer the question. You can't ignore one. In both cases, you must give a good historical background. What is the issue that it's referring to? What's the time period? What's going on around these documents? And then, for set one, you must talk about the relationship between them and make reference to both in doing that and identify clearly, is it cause and effect, similarity or difference, or a turning point in history. In set two, they will point out one of those two documents. You must talk about that document specifically and discuss its reliability based upon the factor of who it's being written for, why it's being written, what the bias is of the people involved, and what the point of view is that may affect the accuracy of it. Finally, the third part of this exam is the civic literacy document-based essay. What does that mean? So you will be given now a new set of 6 documents. Again, they could be bits of writing by historians. They could be actual documents in the terms of letters or reports or quotes from the time period. They could be charts, maps, graphs, anything. For each of those documents, you will be asked a very straightforward question, probably answerable in a sentence or 2, maybe 3, about the document itself. Those should not be that difficult. If you can read the document carefully and think about it carefully, don't jump, it will be asking you to summarize it or pull out a particular piece of information from that document. That should be fairly straightforward. Then you will be asked to write a major essay. That is a full-on 4 or 5 paragraph essay in which you use all 6 of those documents and your knowledge of United States history to write an essay that describes the historical circumstances surrounding a constitutional or civic issue to which those documents refer. So you'll have to figure out, what do all of these 6 documents, what are they all about? They may not be from the same time period. You may get a document that has to do with the civil rights struggle in the 1950s and 60s, and a document from Booker T. Washington or W.E.B. Du Bois from around 1900, and a document from the early 1800s referring to the slave trade. And you might get those. What's holding those together? Well, all of them have to do with the experience of African Americans going from slavery to freedom, moving into the economy, and then the civil rights struggle to be treated as the full citizens that they already were. So that's what's holding it together. So you got to figure that out. Then you have to explain the efforts by individuals, groups, or governments to address this issue. So you have to talk about, for instance, the abolitionist movement to end slavery, and then the civil rights movement, Dr. Martin Luther King, and so on, to address the problem that states were not living up to the 14th Amendment that guaranteed equal protection of the law from after the Civil War. And you'd have to talk about the groups and what they did, what Dr. King did, what W.B. Du Bois did, the NAACP. You should mention that. And finally, you have to discuss the extent to which those efforts were successful, or the impact they had on the United States and American society. So watch, you've got 3 tasks. You have to talk about what is the issue involved here. Second, you must hit something about the people or groups that attempted to address that issue, and then you have to discuss how successful they were at making change. If you don't hit all 3 of those items, you can't get full credit for the essay. You also have to use those 6 documents and outside information, which is to say, information you know that's not in the documents, but you remember from your U.S. history course. If you do all of those, you get full credit on that essay. Now, I will just point out to you the scoring, the grading on this exam is not exactly a simple, straightforward system. These questions here are going to be worth a point apiece, and let me show you how the grading on this will work. Okay, so you're going to have 28 multiple choice questions. So I'm showing you a chart here that will show you how this goes. You see down the side here you have these numbers. So they go 0, and then we have 28. Those 2 CRQs are worth 5 points apiece. So that's another 10 points total, 5 and 5. That gets you to 38. And then those 6 document questions will get you to 1 point apiece. Those individual document questions I mentioned get you to 44. That civic essay that I just mentioned, the big DBQ, is going to be scored out of 5. But you don't just add it up. So if you get a perfect score in your multiple choice, and you get a perfect score on the 2 CRQs, that's another 10 points, and you get all 6 of those documents correct, that's 44 points. Now you write your essay. If you do a perfect job on it, you have a 5 on it. A not so hot job, you have a 2 on it. When we create your score, we will take the 44 here, we'll find the 44, and we'll find your perfect score of 5, and when we put the 2 against each other here and here, we get the number that you get. That's blank at the moment, because the state of New York is not going to tell us what these numbers are until after you take the exam. This is what's called a scaled score system. So let's say you get, 25 out of 28 questions right. You really know your stuff. You do pretty well on those multiple choice. So you get 25 right. Let's say you do a okay job, not great, on those 2 CRQs. So you get a 3 on one and a 4 on another. That's another 7 points. So 7 and 25 is 32. And let's say you get 5 out of 6 of those document questions correct. So that's another 5 points. That gets you to a 37. Okay, there's your 37. And let's say you do an okay job, not really great, on the essay. That gets you a 3 over here, let's say. And so this is the little box that we would look at to find your score. Now you're going to ask, I'm sure, well, what do I need? How low can I go and still pass this exam? And the answer is, we don't know. The state of New York determines that. These numbers are not simple sequences. They are logarithmic. You can go figure that out in your math class. So you have a scaled score, a scaled logarithmic score, and they will then tell us, this over here, 37 and a 3, I'm making up a number for you guys. That might be worth, an 84, let's say, over here, and that we would know. Obviously, a 44 and a 5, that's going to get you a 100. One step down from this might get you a 99. But you might get a 99 here too, and a 99 here too, and you might even get a 99 and a 99, 99, 99, 99. Then we go out to 98s, yeah? And you see, it's not exactly, you can do really well over here, below the essay. You'll get an okay score, but not great. You could do mediocre over here, and get really great on the essay, and again, a not so great score, but, passable. If you really blow both, that's when you're getting into failure territory. What's the message of that you should take away? Everything counts. That's the message to get. Everything counts. So you should do your absolute best to hit each item. If you miss a part of this essay, if you don't bother to describe the circumstances, or you don't actually, you talk about the circumstances, you talk about the people involved, but you don't tell me how successful they were, you don't make some kind of a case there, I can't give you full credit. If you hit each of these, and you make some kind of reference to each of the 6 documents, and you bring in something outside the documents that you know about the issue, well, you're giving yourself a fighting chance to get, at least a 3, maybe a 4, maybe even 5 out of 5 on this essay. And that's going to make a big difference because you're going up a whole column on that chart I showed you. Similarly down here, if you hit each piece of this, you explain the document, and you give me some discussion of whether it's a cause and effect, and you use those words, or a difference, or a turning point, or similarity or difference, I should say. So it could show the 2 groups were more like each other than different. You give me a reason to give you 5 out of 5. Well, if you hit it all, at least 4 out of 5 maybe. Same thing down here. If you give me historical context and you make some specific reference to the audience for the document or its purpose or its bias or its point of view, and you make a case why that makes it more or less reliable, you've hit all of the parts of this. If you don't do a great job, you may not get 5 out of 5, but you're at least at a 3 out of 5 and moving up, maybe a 4 out of 5. And that's going to make a difference on that chart. With the multiple choice, it all comes down to having a good historical sense, knowing enough of your history to be able to give context. And second, reading carefully. Now, in the course of these review videos, we will go through the different types of questions, how to approach each of them, how to answer them, how to sort of squeeze the most points out of it, as well as going over some of the specific material. At the moment, I just want to point this out to you. What is this testing? It's testing your knowledge of U.S. history. And if you look on those, the outline of U.S. history, that I mentioned to you, the OneNote notebook that we are putting up, and the review notes for U.S. history, which is the same notebook but with expanded notes within it, you'll notice that there are 10 periods of time. Well, really, 10 eras, some of them overlap a bit, in U.S. history that they test. First, colonial foundations. And I'll pull this up. 1607 to 1763. What does that tell you? 1607 you should recognize as the Jamestown colony, so the first British colony in North America. 1763 you should recognize as the end of the French and Indian War. So from the first British colonies in North America, through those 13 colonies and the end of the French and Indian War. The second is from the end of the French and Indian War to 1824. Now, why these dates? End of the French and Indian War gets you into the American Revolution. The French and Indian War, if you remember, the results of that, the issues that come out of that, basically trigger the revolution. Then after the revolution, we write the U.S. Constitution. George Washington, John Adams. 1824 is the Jackson presidency, Jacksonian democracy, which is a big change in how we think about government and the presidency. Expansion, nationalism, and sectionalism. Notice you go back a little bit here, 1800 to 1865. So we then step back slightly and start talking about the expansion of the country. So first big expansion is, of course, the Louisiana Purchase. The nationalism within the country, we get a sense of ourselves with the War of 1812 and the victory there. And then sectionalism, really the North and the South going in two different directions, economically, socially, politically, and the big issue behind all of this is, of course, slavery. And that's not going to get resolved until the Civil War, which ends in 1865. Post-Civil War era. The Civil War era ends slavery. But from 1865 to about 1900, we have a whole new set of issues. The newly freed African Americans were treated horrifically, even though they were free of slavery, in that Jim Crow era. You have Reconstruction that takes place after the Civil War. And if you go through this little bit here, you see, we're talking about the Reconstruction era and the social problems that don't get resolved. The 14th, 15th Amendments gave equal rights based on race and gave voting rights to blacks, but it didn't give it to women. So the rights of women are still hanging out there to be resolved. You had the Native Americans who were now being really seriously pushed off their land in the West. So there's a whole set of problems that come up in the post-Civil War era. Another overlapping era here, 1870 to 1920, industrialization and urbanization. We have that second industrial revolution, it's sometimes called, meaning you have people moving off of the farms. They're still farmers, of course, feeding America, but you need fewer farmers with better technology. And so young people move to the cities. You also have massive immigration, particularly from Southern Europe, largely meaning Italy, and Eastern Europe, meaning what today we would call Russia, Ukraine, Hungary, Poland, that area. Why are they going to the cities? Because you have a massive expansion in industry. This is the age of steel buildings, steel bridges, Standard Oil. The kerosene industry takes off. New inventions, electricity comes along. All of a sudden we have electric motors, electric lights, the iron ships, steel ships out there, the Navy expanding. So there's changes happening in American society all the way along, and in American business. So this is the age of the great robber barons, the monopolies, the farmers fighting back with populism, beginnings of progressivism as people try to solve society's problems using government power and government regulation. Okay, next era is the rise of American power. Again, you're hopping back a little bit, 1890 to 1920. This is the age of imperialism, the Spanish-American War, where we take control of the Philippines and Puerto Rico. Cuba becomes a dependent country on the United States. We build the Panama Canal, which allows us to control 2 oceans with our Navy. We acquire, separately from the Spanish-American War, Hawaii. Why acquire Hawaii? We need it as a stopping off point to get to the rest of the world, right? If we're going to involve ourselves in Asia trade now, you need an island halfway across the Pacific where you can resupply your ships that are going to and from, right? Refuel them and all that. World War I comes, and the United States goes from being sort of an out-of-the-way country to being a player in world affairs. Well, that's followed by the 1920s and the 1930s. Prosperity, the 1920s, American economy takes off in a huge way. You get a rise of the middle class in America, this urban middle class, new suburbs around the cities. I will tell you, Staten Island in the 1920s grows exponentially. An awful lot of the neighborhoods on Staten Island, particularly around the North Shore, were built in the 1920s with the population rising here as people moved out of Manhattan to come over to the country, right, the suburbs out here. But that prosperity comes to a crashing halt in the Great Depression. And the Great Depression is a massive change in our mentality as a country. Prior to the Great Depression, the economy ran itself. Government had very little to do with the economy, really. And the average person had very little to do with the government, particularly the federal government. With the Great Depression, we now start expecting the government to step in, fix economic problems, manage the economy to some degree, and provide a kind of safety net for the poorest Americans, elderly Americans, people who are down on their luck, to kind of keep them going. That's a massive change in how we think of the job of government. Of course, the Great Depression is followed by World War II. World War II really, it starts famously, of course, with the invasion of Poland in 1939, but there was a long lead up. Japan invaded China in the early 30s, and it's really 35, 36 where the conflicts start in the Far East. In Europe, we keep getting closer and closer to war, and the United States keeps getting more and more ready for it until finally we are drawn into the war. When the war ends in 1945, you have until 1990 the Cold War. The United States is now a mighty power and has nuclear capability. So does the Soviet Union, and eventually so does China. And the world gets divided into the free world, led by the United States of America and including our allies in Western Europe, versus the Soviet Union and the Soviet bloc, which are the countries dependent on the Soviet Union at the time, like, say, Poland and Hungary and Romania. And eventually, a kind of third slice of the world in China and the countries dependent upon it. Initially, the Soviet Union and China were closer allies. That closeness eventually breaks up, and so it's really China and its sphere of influence, like at the time North Korea, to some degree North Vietnam, the Soviet Union and its sphere of influence in Eastern Europe, and the United States and our sphere of influence with the democracies of Western Europe. And the Cold War is all about that ongoing conflict between us. Not a hot war. We didn't go full-on World War III with the Soviet Union, but little conflicts around the edges, like the Vietnam War, like the Korean War, and a constant threat of nuclear war. 1990, of course, really starting in 1989, that all starts to fall apart. The Soviet bloc falls apart. Eventually, the Soviet Union falls, and so from 1990 on, things have been different. Well, we also talk about social and economic change and domestic issues. So the Cold War is really about our U.S. foreign policy after the World War II. And then the section 10 here is social issues and problems within the country, changes in American society, like the Civil Rights Act, like Modern Women's Act, like the environmental movement, expanded citizens' rights, expanded ideas about free speech and so on in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s. So there's your overview of what the test will look like and what the questions will be like, what the questions will be on these various eras, how it's sort of thought of and organized. So in the next video, we will begin with actually reviewing some of the historical material, walking you through the time periods, and walking you through some of the questions that might be asked and how to approach them.